Hello and welcome to Lore and Sleep. Tonight we travel east, past the edge of what most people think of when they hear the word Rome, past the fall that every schoolbook remembers, into a city built on 7 hills above the water, where 2 seas meet and 2 continents almost touch. We are going to Constantinople, to the empire that called itself Roman for 11 centuries after the city of Rome itself had stopped being able to defend that claim, to a civilization so long-lived and so strange to modern eyes that later historians, unable to find a better word, simply named it after the city where it began, Byzantium. This is the story of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome that did not fall in the 5th century the way its western twin did, but instead kept going, kept ruling, kept building and praying and scheming and surviving for nearly 1,000 years more through plagues and sieges and civil wars and the slow erosion of an empire that never stopped believing, even at its smallest and most surrounded, that it was still Rome. It is a story of extraordinary continuity and extraordinary change happening at the same time, of emperors who ruled from a golden throne that rose mechanically into the air to startle foreign ambassadors, of a single church so large and so strange that when it was built, nobody had ever stood beneath a dome like it before, of theological arguments fought with the same intensity as wars. Because in Byzantium, what you believed about the nature of Christ could get you exiled, blinded, or crowned. It is a story that belongs to the night, because Byzantium itself has always lived somewhat in shadow, overshadowed in the popular imagination by the Rome that came before it and the Renaissance that came after it, 1,000 years of history that most people know almost nothing about, despite its scale and its strangeness and its beauty. Let it come to you slowly now, out of the dark water of the Bosphorus, the lamps of Constantinople, beginning to glow along the shoreline the way they have glowed, in one form or another, for over 1,600 years. If these journeys bring you calm, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, there is nothing you need to do. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let the golden light of 1,000 candles in a great domed church come to you out of the darkness, warm and distant and very old. Let us begin. To understand Byzantium, you first have to let go of the idea that Rome fell in 476. That date, the one every student memorizes, marks the deposition of the last emperor to rule from the city of Rome itself, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, who was quietly pensioned off by a Germanic general with no particular fanfare and no sense that he was closing a chapter of world history. But the Roman Empire, as a political and administrative reality, did not end that year. It had already split more than a century earlier into a western half centered on Italy and an eastern half centered on a new capital that the Emperor Constantine had founded on the site of an old Greek trading town called Byzantium on the European shore of the strait that separates Europe from Asia. Constantine renamed it after himself, and Constantinople, the city of Constantine, became in the year 330 the new heart of the Roman world. The choice of location was not an accident, but a calculation of extraordinary shrewdness. The site sat on a peninsula, bounded by water on 3 sides, the Sea of Marmara to the south, the long deep inlet called the Golden Horn to the north, and the open water of the Bosphorus to the east, which meant that a defender needed to fortify only the western landward side to make the city nearly impregnable. It commanded the strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, which meant it controlled the grain and trade that moved between them, and it sat at the hinge between the Balkans and Anatolia, allowing an emperor to respond quickly to threats from either direction. Constantine built walls, churches, a hippodrome, and an imperial palace, and he populated the new city by offering free grain and land to those willing to move there. And within a few generations, Constantinople had become one of the great cities of the ancient world. When the western half of the empire finally collapsed under the pressure of Gothic and Vandal and Hunnic incursions in the 5th century, the eastern half did not merely survive. It inherited, by default, the full weight of Roman identity. The people who lived in Constantinople and its territories continued to call themselves Romans, Romaioi, for the entire duration of the empire's existence, right up until the year the city finally fell in 1453. They did not think of themselves as a new civilization or a successor state. They thought of themselves as the Roman Empire, uninterrupted, and the word Byzantine, which we use today, was not a term they ever applied to themselves. It was invented centuries later by Western European historians who wanted a tidy way to distinguish the Greek-speaking Orthodox Christian Empire of the East from the Latin-speaking Catholic image of Rome that the West preferred to remember. The territory the Eastern Empire controlled at its founding was immense and immensely varied. The Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and for a time, North Africa, a patchwork of climates and languages and economies held together by a shared currency, a shared bureaucracy, and a shared, if often bitterly contested, faith. Egypt alone supplied enough grain to feed the capital for centuries, and it was the loss of Egypt to Arab conquest in the 7th century, more than any other single event, that forced the empire to reorganize itself around a smaller, more defensible Anatolian core. The empire that resulted from that contraction was leaner, more military in character, and in some ways, more resilient than the sprawling late Roman state it had once been. The land itself shaped the character of the empire in ways that echoed through every century of its history. Anatolia, the great peninsula that makes up most of modern Turkey, is a plateau ringed by mountains, difficult to invade in force, but also difficult to govern efficiently from a single coastal capital. And the Byzantines developed an administrative system of military provinces called themes, specifically to manage this terrain, dividing the empire into districts where local soldier farmers held land in exchange for military service, a system that gave the empire a deep reserve of manpower without the crushing expense of a fully professional standing army. The mountains of the Balkans, by contrast, were a permeable frontier, crossed again and again by Slavic migrations, Bulgar armies, and eventually Ottoman forces, and the story of Byzantine survival in the north was largely a story of fortresses, treaties, and the patient, exhausting work of diplomacy substituting for the military strength the empire increasingly could not afford to project. Climate and disease also left their mark on this world in ways the Byzantines themselves could not have fully understood. In the year 541, a pandemic that historians now call the Plague of Justinian swept through the eastern Mediterranean, carried along the same trade routes that had made Constantinople wealthy, and it killed, by some estimates, close to half the population of the city and a significant fraction of the empire as a whole. The plague returned in waves for 2 centuries afterward, and its demographic and economic damage was so severe that some historians consider it one of the decisive factors that prevented the Emperor Justinian from permanently reuniting the old Roman world, a project he had come remarkably close to achieving just before the sickness arrived. Nothing shaped daily life, high politics, art, and even warfare in Byzantium as thoroughly as Christianity did, and nothing about Byzantine Christianity would feel entirely familiar to a modern visitor of any denomination. This was a world in which the emperor was not simply a political ruler, but God's chosen representative on earth, a concept historians call Caesaropapism, in which the head of state held enormous influence over the church, even without holding priestly office himself. Church and state were not separate spheres in Byzantium. They were 2 expressions of the same divine order, and an emperor's legitimacy rested as much on his piety and his orthodoxy as on his armies. This fusion of religious and political authority meant that theological disputes in Byzantium were never merely academic. They were matters of state, capable of toppling emperors and dividing cities into rioting factions. The most consequential of these disputes was the controversy over icons, the religious images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints that filled Byzantine churches and homes. Beginning in the 720s, the Emperor Leo III and his successors became convinced that the veneration of these images amounted to idolatry, a violation of the biblical commandment against graven images, and they launched a policy of iconoclasm, literally the smashing of icons, that saw centuries-old paintings and mosaics stripped from church walls and destroyed across the empire. The iconoclast controversy tore Byzantine society apart for more than a century, with intervals of restored icon veneration, followed by renewed periods of destruction, and it was not finally resolved until 843, in an event still celebrated in the Orthodox Church as the Feast of Orthodoxy, when icons were permanently restored, and the theological argument in their favor that an image of Christ was not a false idol, but a legitimate honoring of God made flesh, was formally and finally accepted. The scars of the controversy remained visible for centuries afterward in the empty niches and whitewashed walls of churches that had lost their original decoration, and in a deep cultural anxiety about the proper relationship between the material and the divine that continued to inform Byzantine art long after the crisis had technically ended. The theological hair-splitting that outsiders sometimes mocked, the arguments over the precise nature of Christ's divine and human natures that had already split the church at councils in the 4th and 5th centuries were not, to the Byzantines, hair-splitting at all. They were questions of ultimate consequence, because getting the nature of Christ wrong was understood to jeopardize the entire project of human salvation. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing centuries later with the skepticism of the Enlightenment, mocked the Byzantines for caring so intensely about a single letter of Greek. The difference between the words homoousios and homoousios, of the same substance versus of similar substance, in describing the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. But to a Byzantine theologian, that single letter was the difference between a coherent Christian cosmos and a heretical one, and men were willing to be exiled, imprisoned, or killed over it. Monasticism was woven just as deeply into the fabric of Byzantine religious life as the great cathedral in the capital. Thousands of monasteries dotted the empire, from vast wealthy foundations with extensive land holdings to isolated hermitages perched on mountain cliffs, and monks played roles in Byzantine society that went far beyond prayer and contemplation. They were scribes who copied and preserved classical and Christian texts through centuries when literacy elsewhere in Europe had nearly collapsed. They were political actors who could mobilize popular opinion against an emperor's policies, as they frequently did during the iconoclast controversy. And they were, in the case of a place like Mount Athos, the self-governing monastic republic on a remote peninsula in northern Greece, custodians of a form of spiritual life so intense and so ordered that it became a model for Orthodox monasticism across the entire Slavic and Greek world, a model that continues, remarkably, to function on that same mountain to this day. The liturgy itself, the actual experience of worship inside a Byzantine church, was designed as a kind of controlled encounter with heaven, an aesthetic and sensory experience meant to overwhelm the ordinary faculties of the worshiper with candlelight and incense and the layered harmonies of unaccompanied chant rising into a dome, painted with the image of Christ as ruler of the universe, looking down from the highest point of the architecture, as if from the vault of the sky itself. A famous story, almost certainly embellished but capturing something true, tells of envoys sent by a 10th century Rus prince to investigate the different religions of the world, who reported after attending a service in the great church of Constantinople that they no longer knew whether they were in heaven or on earth, because such beauty did not exist elsewhere, and that they could not forget what they had seen. Whether or not the story is literally accurate, it survived because it captured something the Byzantines themselves believed absolutely, that their worship was a genuine window into the divine. At the heart of the Byzantine world stood a single city so dominant, so wealthy, and so heavily fortified that for the vast majority of the empire's history, its capital was simply understood to be nearly unconquerable, a belief that shaped Byzantine strategy for 1,000 years, and that was, for almost all of that time, entirely justified. Constantinople, in its prime, held perhaps 500,000 people at a time when most European cities numbered in the low thousands, and it functioned as the largest, richest, and most sophisticated urban center in the Christian world for the better part of a millennium. The defenses that made this possible were the Theodosian walls, built in the early 5th century under the Emperor Theodosius II, and expanded and repaired continuously for the next 1,000 years. The walls were not a single barrier, but a defense in depth, an outer moat that could be flooded, a low outer wall, a wide terrace, and then the great inner wall itself, rising over 10 meters high and studded with nearly 100 towers, each positioned so that its defenders could bring flanking fire onto any point where an enemy might attempt to breach the wall in front of it. For nearly 800 years, no army managed to take Constantinople by force through these land walls, and the handful of times the city did fall, it fell either through naval assault against its weaker sea walls, through betrayal from within, or in the end, to an enemy armed with a weapon the walls builders could never have imagined. gunpowder artillery. Inside those walls, the city organized itself around a set of institutions and spaces that would have been instantly recognizable to any Byzantine citizen as the essential landmarks of their world. The Hippodrome, a vast chariot racing stadium, seated tens of thousands of spectators, was not merely an entertainment venue, but a genuine center of political life, the place where the emperor appeared publicly to the people, where popular discontent could be voiced in the roar of the crowd, and where, in 532, a riot between two rival chariot racing factions, the Blues and the Greens, spiraled out of control into the Nika riots, an uprising that nearly overthrew the Emperor Justinian, and that was suppressed only when Justinian's general Belisarius led troops into the Hippodrome itself and, according to the historian Procopius, massacred as many as 30,000 rioters trapped inside. It was in the aftermath of that same riot, with much of the city center burned to the ground, that Justinian commissioned the building that remains, to this day, the single most extraordinary monument the Byzantine Empire produced. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, completed in 537 after only about 5 years of construction, an astonishingly short time frame for a building of its scale. The Hagia Sophia was crowned by a dome that seemed, to those who stood beneath it, to float without visible support, ringed at its base by a row of windows that filled the interior with a diffuse golden light. Contemporary accounts describe worshippers who felt the dome seemed suspended from heaven by a golden chain rather than resting on the walls below it, and modern engineers still study the building's structural solutions with genuine admiration for what its architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, achieved with the mathematics and materials available to them. The Great Palace of Constantinople, a sprawling complex of buildings, gardens, and ceremonial halls rather than a single structure, was the administrative and residential heart of the empire, and Byzantine court ceremony reached a level of elaborate theater that foreign visitors found both dazzling and faintly ridiculous. The Book of Ceremonies, compiled under the Emperor Constantine VII in the 10th century, records in exhaustive detail the choreography expected of imperial receptions, including the famous mechanical throne room, where bronze lions were rigged to roar, and a golden tree filled with mechanical birds sang, while the imperial throne itself, through hidden machinery, could be made to rise into the air during an audience, so that a foreign ambassador who had bowed before the emperor at floor level would look up again to find him seated high above, a piece of engineered theater specifically designed to overwhelm visitors with a sense of the emperor's more than human authority. Beyond its walls and monuments, Constantinople functioned as the economic hinge of the medieval world, its markets connecting the Baltic amber trade and the Rus fur trade in the north to the silk routes of Central Asia and the spice trade of the Indian Ocean in the east. The gold coin known as the solidus, or nomisma, maintained a remarkably stable purity for more than 7 centuries, making it the most trusted currency in the medieval Mediterranean and Near East, accepted and hoarded from England to India in a way that gave Byzantine commerce a reach far beyond the empire's actual borders. The Byzantine throne was, in theory, not hereditary in the strict sense. An emperor ruled by the grace of God, confirmed by acclamation, and any man of sufficient ambition, skill, and luck could in principle seize it, a fact that made Byzantine political history extraordinarily volatile and often extraordinarily violent. In practice, dynasties did form and did try to entrench themselves, but the empire's history is punctuated again and again by usurpations, palace coup, and the mutilation, blinding, or exile of defeated rivals, since a physically disfigured man was considered ineligible to rule, which made blinding a common and, by Byzantine standards, relatively merciful alternative to execution. Justinian I, who came to power in 527, remains the emperor most associated with the ambition to restore the old Roman world in its entirety. Through his brilliant general Belisarius, he reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and much of Italy from the Ostrogoths, briefly reuniting the Mediterranean basin under Roman rule. For the first time in generations, he commissioned the Hagia Sophia, and he ordered the compilation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, a systematic codification of Roman law that would go on to form the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe for the next 1,500 years, arguably Justinian's most durable legacy of all, outlasting every one of his military conquests by well over 1,000 years. Beside Justinian stood a figure who became, in her own right, one of the most remarkable individuals in Byzantine history, the Empress Theodora, born into poverty, reportedly the daughter of a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome, and working before her marriage in a profession the Byzantine sources describe with considerable disapproval. Theodora rose to become Justinian's wife, co-ruler, and according to Procopius, the decisive voice that kept Justinian on his throne during the Nika riots, when advisors urged him to flee the city, and Theodora reportedly declared that purple, the color of imperial rule, made the finest burial shroud, persuading her husband to stay and fight rather than run. She used her position to advocate for women's legal rights, funding refugees for former prostitutes, and pushing through legal reforms that expanded women's ability to own property and initiate divorce, a legacy of practical reform that stood in sharp contrast to the disdain with which conservative chroniclers of her own era wrote about her origins. The concept of being born in the purple, porphyrogenitos, referred to children born to a reigning emperor within a specific chamber of the palace lined with purple stone, and it carried enormous symbolic weight throughout Byzantine history as a marker of pure, unquestionable legitimacy, one that ambitious usurpers who had seized the throne by force could never claim for themselves, no matter how successfully they ruled. This obsession with legitimate birth existed in constant tension with the empire's equally strong tradition of meritocratic usurpation, producing a political culture in which brilliant generals of humble origin, like the soldier emperor Basil I, could found new dynasties, while still needing, once in power, to marry their way into the appearance of legitimacy that only the purple-born bloodline could confer. Basil II, who ruled for nearly 50 years, beginning in the late 10th century, represents the empire near the height of its later medieval power. An emperor whose relentless, decades-long military campaigns against the Bulgarian Empire earned him the grim epithet Bulgar Slayer after a battle in 1014 in which, according to a story that later chroniclers may have exaggerated, he had thousands of captured Bulgarian soldiers blinded before sending them home, leaving one man in each group of 100 with a single working eye to guide the rest. Whatever the precise historical truth of that episode, it captures something of the ruthless pragmatism that a millennium of survival on a contested frontier had bred into Byzantine statecraft alongside the genuine cultural sophistication that the same court could produce in the very same generation. Empresses who ruled in their own right rather than merely as consorts were rare but not unknown. Irene of Athens, who orchestrated the blinding of her own son to seize sole power in the late 8th century, and who presided over the restoration of icon veneration at the Second Council of Nicaea, ruled as sole empress for 5 years, a fact so unprecedented and so unsettling to contemporaries in the western half of the old Roman world that the papacy and the Frankish king Charlemagne used the supposed illegitimacy of a woman ruling alone in Constantinople as part of their justification for crowning Charlemagne as a rival Roman emperor in the West in the year 800, a coronation that Byzantium never recognized and that opened a rift in the very idea of who legitimately represented Rome, a rift that would never fully close. Byzantium was, for the vast majority of its 11 centuries, a state under nearly constant military pressure, ringed by enemies that shifted across time but never disappeared. Persians and then Arabs in the east, Bulgars and Slavs, and later Pechenegs and Cumans in the north, Normans and Venetians, and eventually Ottoman Turks, pressing from the west and south. Surviving this level of sustained threat for so long required a military and diplomatic system of remarkable sophistication, one that relied as much on intelligence, bribery, marriage alliances, and psychological theater as it did on the battlefield itself. The most famous Byzantine military technology, and one whose exact composition remains a genuine historical mystery to this day, was Greek fire, an incendiary liquid weapon first used in the late 7th century that could be projected from ship-mounted siphons onto enemy vessels and that, remarkably, continued to burn even on the surface of water, making it especially devastating in naval combat. Greek fire was credited with saving Constantinople itself from Arab sieges in 674 and again in 717, at moments when the young Islamic Caliphate's expansion seemed poised to sweep away the Byzantine state entirely, and the formula was guarded as one of the empire's most closely held state secrets, known only to a single family of manufacturers, so effectively protected that its precise chemical composition, whether based on naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, or some combination of these, has never been definitively reconstructed by modern historians or chemists. Byzantine military doctrine, as preserved in surviving manuals like the Strategicon, attributed to the Emperor Maurice, emphasized caution, deception, and the avoidance of unnecessary pitched battles in a way that later Western European chivalric culture, with its emphasis on individual glory and direct confrontation, often found puzzling or even cowardly. Byzantine generals were trained to prefer ambush to open battle, to use spies and bribery to divide their enemies before ever engaging them, and to value a bloodless victory achieved through cunning far above a costly one achieved through valor, a philosophy summarized in the frequently repeated Byzantine military maxim that the wise general wins his wars before he ever has to fight them. The theme system, developed in the 7th century as a response to the loss of Egypt and Syria to Arab conquest, organized Anatolia into military districts governed by a strategos, a general who commanded both civil and military authority in his region, and who could raise a locally rooted army from soldier farmers granted hereditary land in exchange for military obligation. This system gave the shrunken 7th and 8th century empire a resilient, self-financing defensive capacity precisely when its treasury and its old professional legions could no longer be sustained, and many historians consider it the single most important institutional innovation that allowed Byzantium to survive the catastrophic territorial losses of the Arab conquests, rather than collapsing entirely as the Sassanid Persian Empire did in the very same decades. Diplomacy for Byzantium was never a soft alternative to warfare, but a continuation of it by other means, conducted with a sophistication that had no real parallel anywhere else in the medieval world. Byzantine diplomats cultivated relationships with dozens of neighboring peoples simultaneously, played rival powers against one another, arranged marriages between imperial relatives and foreign rulers to create webs of obligation, and developed an entire diplomatic vocabulary of hierarchy in which foreign rulers were formally ranked according to their usefulness and their perceived civilization, granted or denied specific titles and forms of address, depending on how the empire wished to flatter or slight them in a given year. Constantine VII's Treatise on the Administration of the Empire, written as a guide for his son, is essentially a masterclass in playing one barbarian people off against another, treating the entire frontier world as a chessboard to be manipulated through information, gifts, and calculated insult rather than simply met with the sword. The Byzantine economy rested on a combination of agricultural taxation, controlled state industries, and a commercial network that made Constantinople the great clearinghouse of medieval Eurasian trade, and nowhere was this more visible than in the empire's relationship to silk. For centuries, silk had to be imported at enormous cost along the overland routes from China, a strategic vulnerability that left Byzantine luxury production dependent on trade relationships with a Persian empire that was, for much of that same period, the Byzantines' principal military rival. According to a story recorded by the historian Procopius, this vulnerability was ended in the 6th century when 2 Nestorian monks, at Justinian's request, smuggled silkworm eggs out of Central Asia, concealed inside hollow bamboo canes, allowing the empire to establish its own silk industry and break its dependence on Persian middlemen, a piece of industrial espionage that, whether entirely accurate in its details or not, marked a genuine turning point in Byzantine economic history. The imperial silk workshops that resulted from this breakthrough became a state monopoly of extraordinary value, producing fabrics dyed in Tyrian purple, a color extracted at enormous cost from the glands of thousands of sea snails and legally restricted to the imperial family and the very highest ranks of the court, a restriction enforced with genuine severity because the color itself functioned as a visible, unforgeable marker of rank in a society where clothing, more than almost anything else, communicated a person's precise place within an intricately layered hierarchy. Bolts of Byzantine silk, gifted by emperors to foreign rulers and church leaders across Europe, still survive today, wrapped around the relics of saints in cathedral treasuries from Aachen to Canterbury, tangible evidence of a trade network and a diplomatic strategy that reached across the entire medieval world. The Byzantine court itself operated according to an administrative and honorific hierarchy of bewildering complexity, with dozens of ranked titles, from the humble to the exalted, each carrying its own privileges, its own prescribed clothing, and its own position in the elaborate processions and ceremonies that structured court life. Advancement within this system depended on a combination of birth, merit, imperial favor, and very often the payment of substantial sums of money. Since offices could be purchased outright, a practice that provided the treasury with steady revenue, while also ensuring that the individuals who staffed the Byzantine bureaucracy generally had a significant personal financial stake in the stability and continuity of the system that employed them. Beneath the glittering surface of the court, the majority of the Byzantine population lived agricultural lives that would have been recognizable to farmers anywhere in the medieval Mediterranean, cultivating grain, olives, and vines, raising livestock, and organizing their communities around village churches, whose saints' festivals provided the rhythm of the agricultural and religious calendar alike. Byzantine cities beyond the capital, places like Thessaloniki, Antioch, and Ephesus, functioned as regional hubs of craft production and trade, each with its own local elites, its own bishop, and its own relationship, sometimes cooperative and sometimes resentful, to the distant authority of Constantinople. Byzantine intellectual and artistic culture, meanwhile, preserved and transmitted an enormous portion of the surviving literature of the ancient Greek world, copied and recopied by generations of monks and scholars at a time when much of that same literature had been lost or forgotten in Western Europe. Constantinople's schools taught rhetoric, philosophy, and the classical Greek authors alongside Christian theology, and it was in substantial part through Byzantine manuscripts, preserved through the centuries, and eventually carried west by refugee scholars fleeing the empire's final collapse, that texts of Plato, Aristotle, and the Greek dramatists and historians survived to fuel the Italian Renaissance, an intellectual debt that the humanists of 15th century Florence and Venice owed to Byzantine scholarship far more than they generally cared to acknowledge. The relationship between Byzantium and the Latin Christian West, always complicated by differences in language, liturgy, and political culture, deteriorated across the centuries into one of the most consequential ruptures in Christian history. In 1054, disputes over papal authority, the wording of a key line in the Christian creed, and long-accumulated cultural and theological resentment culminated in mutual excommunications exchanged between representatives of the Pope in Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople, an event now remembered as the Great Schism, which formally divided Christianity into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, a division that, remarkably, has still never been healed nearly 1,000 years later. Byzantium's relationship with the crusading movement that began in 1095 was fraught from its very first moments. The Emperor Alexios I had originally requested Western military assistance to help reclaim Anatolian territory. Lost to Seljuk Turks, expecting a modest force of mercenaries he could direct according to Byzantine strategic priorities. What arrived instead was an enormous, largely uncontrollable mass movement of Frankish knights and pilgrims marching toward Jerusalem with their own independent goals, and the mutual suspicion and cultural friction between Greek-speaking Byzantines, who regarded the Western knights as unsophisticated and uncouth, and Latin crusaders, who regarded the Byzantines as effete, treacherous, and insufficiently committed to holy war, poisoned relations between East and West for the better part of 2 centuries. That poison reached its catastrophic climax in 1204, when the Fourth Crusade diverted from its original goal of attacking Egypt by a combination of Venetian commercial ambition and Byzantine dynastic intrigue, turned its weapons instead against Constantinople itself. The Crusader and Venetian forces breached the sea walls, stormed the city, and subjected it to a sack of extraordinary and deliberate brutality, looting churches, melting down bronze statues that had stood since antiquity, and shipping enormous quantities of relics, art, and treasure back to Western Europe, including the 4 bronze horses that still stand today above the entrance of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. A Latin empire was installed on the Byzantine throne, and the Byzantine state fractured into several rival successor kingdoms, the largest based in the city of Nicaea, that spent the next half-century fighting both the Latin occupiers and one another for the right to eventually reclaim Constantinople. Michael VIII Palaiologos, ruler of the Nicaean successor state, finally recaptured Constantinople in 1261, restoring a Byzantine emperor to the throne of the old capital and founding the dynasty that would rule in increasingly diminished circumstances until the empire's final end. But the empire that Michael restored was a shadow of what had existed before 1204. Its treasury had been looted, its trade increasingly dominated by Venetian and Genoese merchants who had extracted crippling commercial privileges in exchange for their support, and its territory whittled down over the following 2 centuries by the relentless expansion of a new power rising in Anatolia, the Ottoman Turks. The 14th and early 15th centuries saw a Byzantine state reduced, in real terms, to little more than the city of Constantinople itself, and a scattering of increasingly isolated territories in Greece, even as its emperors continued to be received across Europe with the full ceremonial deference due to the heirs of Rome, a strange and poignant mismatch between diminished reality and enduring symbolic prestige. Byzantine emperors traveled personally to Western courts, including a famous journey by John VIII Palaiologos to Italy in the 1430s in a failed attempt to negotiate a reunion of the Catholic and Orthodox churches in exchange for Western military aid against the encroaching Ottomans, an aid that, when it finally came, arrived far too little and far too late to change what was, by that point, becoming an increasingly foreseeable outcome. By the spring of 1453, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than the walled city of Constantinople itself, ruled by the Emperor Constantine XI, over a population that modern historians estimate at somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people, a small fraction of the city's population at its medieval height, rattling around inside walls built for a metropolis many times its actual size. Facing this diminished but still formidably fortified city was the young Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, barely in his 20s, who had resolved, with an intensity that alarmed even some of his own advisors, to succeed where every previous besieger of Constantinople across 11 centuries had failed. Mehmed's preparations were extraordinary in their scale and their technological ambition. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who had originally offered his services to the Byzantines, but had been turned away for lack of funds, to cast a series of massive bronze cannons, including one so enormous that it reportedly required 60 oxen and hundreds of men to transport and could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton, weapons designed for the specific purpose of doing what no medieval siege engine had ever managed, breaking through the Theodosian walls that had defended the city for 1,000 years. Mehmed also ordered the construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, positioned to control the strait and cut Constantinople off from potential relief by sea, and, in one of the siege's most audacious episodes, had his ships hauled overland on a specially built road of greased logs to bypass a great chain the Byzantines had stretched across the entrance of the Golden Horn, allowing an Ottoman fleet to appear inside the supposedly protected harbor in a single night. The siege itself lasted 53 days, from early April to the 29th of May, 1453, with a defending garrison of perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 men, including a contingent of Genoese soldiers led by a professional condottiere named Giovanni Giustiniani, holding out against an Ottoman force numbering in the tens of thousands, sustained by continuous cannon bombardment that gradually reduced sections of the ancient walls to rubble. The final assault came in the pre-dawn hours of the 29th of May, and after a defense of extraordinary tenacity, the city's defenses finally failed. Reportedly, after Giustiniani was severely wounded and withdrew from the walls, an act that, whether decisive or not, is remembered in the traditional narrative as the moment the defense began to collapse. The Emperor Constantine XI, according to the accounts that later became legend, threw off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting alongside his remaining soldiers, disappearing into the chaos of the city's final hours, his body never conclusively identified afterward, a fittingly mysterious end for the last Roman emperor. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across the whole of Christian Europe, understood immediately by contemporaries as an event of civilization-altering significance, the definitive end of an empire that, however diminished it had become, still represented an unbroken line of Roman authority stretching back to Augustus. Mehmed II entered the city in triumph and, rather than destroying it, made it his own new capital, converting the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, a transformation of the great church that stands, in modified form to this day, and rebuilding and repopulating the city under the new name that would eventually become Istanbul, even as many of its inhabitants and much of the wider world continued for generations afterward to refer to it by its old Byzantine name. The empire was gone, but its legacy did not simply vanish with it. Byzantine scholars fleeing the city's fall and the decades of instability that preceded it carried Greek manuscripts and Greek learning westward into Italy, feeding directly into the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance already underway there. Byzantine religious, artistic, and legal traditions had, by that point, already been transmitted northward into the Slavic world through the conversion of Bulgaria, Serbia, and, most consequentially, the Rus principalities centered on Kiev and later Moscow, whose rulers, after Constantinople's fall, increasingly styled Moscow as a third Rome, the inheritor of Byzantine imperial and religious authority, a claim whose echoes can still be traced in Russian political culture and Orthodox Christian identity centuries later. The double-headed eagle, the law codes, the dome of churches, the intricate court ceremonial, the entire theological and artistic vocabulary of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, all of it is Byzantium's inheritance, still living, still practiced, still visible in the world 11 centuries after Constantine first raised his new capital on the shore of the Bosphorus, and nearly 6 centuries after that capital's final, inevitable fall. And so, we leave the Byzantine Empire resting in the darkness of 11 centuries. We stood at the founding of Constantinople on its 7 hills above the water, and we watched the western half of Rome collapse while its eastern twin endured, reorganizing itself again and again around new threats and new necessities, without ever quite giving up the conviction that it was still, in some unbroken sense, Rome itself. We walked beneath the impossible floating dome of the Hagia Sophia, and we sat in the golden throne room where mechanical lions roared to overwhelm foreign ambassadors, and we watched Justinian and Theodora hold their throne against a riot that nearly ended everything. We followed the armies and the diplomats who kept an empire alive for 1,000 years, through cunning as much as through the sword, through Greek fire and marriage alliances and the patient, exhausting work of playing one enemy against another. We felt the wound of the Great Schism and the deeper wound of 1204, when the Crusaders, who should have been allies, became the empire's most devastating enemy, and we stood, at the very end, on the walls of a city reduced to a fraction of its former self, watching Constantine XI disappear into the last chaotic hours of a Roman Empire that had somehow, astonishingly, lasted 11 centuries longer than anyone watching Rome fall in the 5th century could possibly have expected. These are human stories. The emperors were human, and so were the monks, and the silk weavers, and the soldiers on the walls, and the empire they built was as flawed and as remarkable as anything human beings have ever built together. If this journey brought you some calm, you might like the video, or subscribe to the channel, or leave a small, quiet comment below. It helps others find their way here. And every person who finds their way here is one more person sleeping a little more gently tonight. There is another story waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and let the night continue, and let the ancient world keep talking in its old, slow voice. But for now, there is nothing left to follow. The walls are quiet. The great dome is dark. The last emperor has gone into the night. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open slowly, the way hands open when a long watch has finally ended and there is nothing left to guard. Let your breathing find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, in and out, like the water of the Bosphorus moving in the dark between 2 continents, patient and ancient and indifferent to the passage of all these years. Sleep well, and good night.